Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast for the week of February the 1st, 2021. I'm Jim Henson, Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. And today I'm joined again by Josh Blank, Research Director for the very same Texas Politics Project. Good afternoon, Josh.
Oh, thanks for having me back.
Well, we missed you.
Well,
both of the previous guests sent their regards.
Well, I'm glad I still have a job.
Well, you have this one anyway.
Right, at least this one.
So we had Josh back today. The big event so far this week, if you're in the world of Texas politics, is Governor Greg Abbott's State of the State speech. We're recording Tuesday midday, and he gave it last night. And I say last night, and there's an asterisk on that. Like so many other things, the speech was not the usual State of the State. It was delivered in the early evening via a network of local stations owned by Nexstar, and delivered from a location, a business in Lockhart, Texas, rather than the usual format, which is to be done live at the Capitol before the legislature. And, in one of the, various kind of oddities that I'm sure will come up in this or may come up in our discussion, legislators were piped in via video platforms, which were displayed in a grid and I think with cutaway shots. Is that right? I mean, it looked like
there were a few cutaways, but not too many.
Yeah, I mean, well, you don't want to get away from the main show, but I digress.
Well, except for I
get ahead of myself. So,
we'll come back.
So it was an unusual state of the state that led to all kinds of speculation that maybe we'll get to as well. But to lay the groundwork, as most listeners to this will know, this is an address that during legislative session years is typically used by governors to announce what are the so-called emergency items. And I think it seems like, most every legislative year at some point or another, you have to explain why emergency is kind of a term of art here. These items are constitutionally defined as quote unquote emergencies because they have a special status in the process. The Texas Constitution prohibits the House and the Senate from passing legislation during the first 60 days of a regular session unless each chamber suspends the rule by a vote of 4/5 of the membership, which of course isn't unheard of for certain housekeeping things, but substantively doesn't really happen very often. And that rule holds unless the legislation applies to a matter that is declared by the governor to be an emergency. And for the footnote readers among you, that's in Article 3, Section 5 of the Texas Constitution. Now, as Governor Abbott illustrated yesterday, and as you should be able to take from this, what constitutes an emergency is really anything that the governor wants to be prioritized in a given session. So if a bill is related to a governor's emergency items, member can decide to vote on it earlier in the session to move it through the process earlier. So, in most ways, most of the time when I think about this and when we talk about this at the, from a academic but also a practical perspective, the emergency items, give the governor a shot early in the session at a kind of procedural. At a procedural effort to manage the agenda or to try to shape the agenda by setting these things aside that can be handled earlier in the session when everything else essentially has to wait. Less procedurally, and it's also a mechanism for signaling that is, as we saw last night, I think, related to the governor's ability as the head of state and as the person in state government who occupies the quote unquote bully pulpit to signal to other political actors what he or she is interested in. So last night, the governor laid out 5 areas that he classified as emergency items: broadband expansion, passing laws to prevent cities from defunding the police, bail reform, and he's in one of the few areas of real specificity. He cited the Damon Allen Act, which we can talk about. In probably the broadest category, he talked about the need for the emergency, quote unquote, of election integrity. And then he talked about civil liability protections for individuals and businesses in the context of COVID. So, that's kind of the overview, and those are the things he laid out, and he laid them out very generally. So you were watching closely last night, Josh. I'm wondering at first cut what really stood out to you, or, what your big takeaway was as you watched from home. I assume you were at home.
Oh, yeah. I think the biggest thing that stood out to me really was I guess I would describe it as the narrow definition of the COVID response through the use of the emergency items, right? So the emergency items are only one way to do this. I mean, not everything that's important is going to be an emergency item. But I thought, listening to the speech overall last night and knowing that, COVID is the issue that the state is facing, as it's also the issue that the country is facing. And really, practically most of the other things, that you would want to have happen, sending kids back to schools, getting businesses up and running requires, more containment and more response to COVID. What I was sort of interested about here, and I think, I've been talking about this for, at least, probably a couple weeks now, but, we've been thinking about, what is the legislative response to COVID look like? And what I mean by that is I don't necessarily mean, even what are they going to do behind the scenes? I mean, I assume there's going to be a lot of stuff that goes on about various technical matters that aren't really interesting to most people, but are important. But the issue is that if voters say, hey, look, the state's still reeling from COVID, the legislature is now just showing up because of our system to make a response, what are the visible and the tangible sort of legislative deliverables that people can say, the legislature did a good job, trying to fix these problems caused by COVID. And I don't know what those are. And I was kind of hoping last night that the governor could help me out a little bit. But when I look at that whole speech, in sum total, it's like, well, what are the COVID specific things? Well, it's civil liability protections on the one hand, for businesses. Okay. We've been talking about that at the national level. Alcohol to go sales seem to be the most, and I'm not trying to be tongue in cheek. I mean, I'm being serious. It seemed to be the other thing that was.
Well, he mentioned it explicitly, so you're not putting words in his mouth. Well,
it's most direct. Well, I say it's most directly COVID related because the other two that seem COVID related: broadband access, and what was the other one I'm thinking of? There's another one besides broadband access that you could say. Oh, and telemedicine. Those are two issues that have been around,
which are related.
They're related, but these are not new issues. It's not as though we weren't talking about these before COVID. We're talking about the last session. We would have been talking about broadband access this session, whether COVID happened or not. It may not have been an emergency item. But so I think, that's sort of the thing really struck me. I mean, I'm still kind of wondering again, the governor is a politician, and politicians are always, seeking advantage in sort of public perceptions, which I think is a good thing. I'm not saying that as a negative, but there's a bunch of other elected officials who just showed up, and I'm kind of still wondering how that's going to play out and what that's going to look like. And I don't think the governor really provided into the State of the State speech like a clear sort of definition of what the Texas response is going to look like through the legislative channels. And that's sort of what struck me first.
Yeah, I was
going to say you were there.
Yeah,
you were actually you were lucky enough to be in Lockhart last night. I mean, what was it like being there on the ground? What stuck out to you?
Last night and all morning. For people that weren't, didn't watch the whole production or only watched on the internet or something, I wound up being part of a brief roundtable after the governor's State of the State and what we haven't mentioned yet, the Democrats' response, which was pre-recorded with Sally Hernandez and Josh Hinkle, who work for KXAN here in Austin. Sally's an anchor and Josh does the morning show, their morning news show on Sunday mornings that focuses on Texas. And with State Representative Jeannie Morrison and State Senator Royce West, who also ran unsuccessfully for the Senate nomination, U.S. Senate nomination in the last election. And, so I did, get to see the production from on the ground, which, really actually involves, a lot of rehearsals that wound up not helping an enormous amount because the political leaders weren't there. It wasn't not helpful at all, but, without the elected officials that were going to be on the panel there.
They seem to have no problem.
Yeah, no, they did not have any problem. That would be correct. And that, which is, fine, which I should have anticipated. I certainly did. But I think, other than that, it involves a lot of waiting around, as you know, from having done these, you did a debate during the last election cycle and things like this. So, I was struck by, I think, a couple of things that, may be evident on the ground there. One is, the high level of production value that went into doing this, in this new format, which is, there were a lot of people thrown at this. It was clearly something that had been discussed quite a bit in terms of production design. Now, we'd be criticizing them if they hadn't. If it had looked like, they did this in a barn or, in somebody's desk or a Facebook Live, we'd be saying, how come they didn't put more into this?
Yeah.
But I think it was, you had to be struck by the fact that this was a pretty big production, and, the governor was heavily staffed while he was there. The network was heavily staffed. So, a lot went into this. And I think that fed, frankly, some speculation that the governor has larger ambitions. We've talked about that a lot. Maybe it'll come back to it. I'm a little skeptical of that. But, nonetheless, I don't think they would have it wouldn't have made any sense to do this in kind of a, half-assed sort of way. And so, nonetheless, it's hard not to be struck by just all the labor going on there and what was going on. I mean, I think, in terms of the substance of this, I mean, I'm struck by a couple of things. I mean, one, related to what you're saying, the degree to which, there was an interesting, to my mind, mismatch from a pure policy perspective from, the rhetorical flourishes in the speech itself and in the governor's delivery of the speech, I think. Committee, that flagged the seriousness and the unusualness of the pandemic and the degree to which, 2020, as everybody's saying, was a tough and unusual year. But in the end, the lack of actual policy delivery on that. And you and I have been talking, as you mentioned, we've been talking about, well, what are they going to do? Well, I think, when we're looking at a vaccine distribution system that has ramped up very slowly, when we looked at a testing system which has gotten better, but still seems to be not quite as thorough as it could be, and the fact that we don't seem to even be talking about, sustained contact tracing. Now experts will say the contact, we've missed the boat on contact tracing. But it does seem to me that there are things in terms of healthcare response and for that matter, education, the educational situation very much on people's minds in terms of equipment. I think to reduce all that to basically broadband and civil liability protections struck me as, I said odd, but what I would say, it struck me as strategic and a kind of commitment that I'll be interesting to see the results of. Because, we've said on this podcast, and I think we've said in writing that, there is this impression that particularly since the vaccine was discovered and, there's the sense that, eventually people will get a vaccine, although that eventually is getting stretched out in some ways, it seems like. That it's been a little bit of a waiting game from the state leadership, and that they will be doing that a lot of state leaders are essentially kind of waiting out the vaccination in order to avoid making risky policy commitments. And we say risky given the what we know about public opinion and what we've seen in public opinion.
What do you mean by risky policy? I mean,
well, what I mean by risky is that there are still substantial, but not, not a majority, but to put it the other way, not a majority, but still substantial elements of the governor's political base who are skeptical about the seriousness of the virus and skeptical about, the degree to which government should aggressively get involved in addressing the virus. And in many ways, that was the political story of 2020. And you've done the most recent polling in that because you did the Lyceum poll. So does that and so the Texas Lyceum poll, which you also serve as director for, and you can talk about the Lyceum to a greater or lesser extent as background. But you guys released a poll just in the last week or so, about a week ago, right?
Yeah, about a week ago, last week. Yeah.
I know it seems like a long time ago, but I think
It
that was
feels
just
longer than
last
that.
week.
No, it's just last week, last Thursday. Not even a week ago.
That had a ton of data on perceptions of economic impact, and so I still think that pattern of big differences between Republicans and Democrats is holding out. Am I right about that?
But see, that you're right, and I mean, I think this just reminds me of something you said, but I'll just take it. I mean, you're right. I mean, the thing is that we are still seeing these partisan differences in sort of the views of the pandemic, and really when we're talking about the seriousness of it. It's not as though Republican. I mean, I always want to say, and I should say this is very important. It's really a very small share of people in general who deny the seriousness of the pandemic. It just so happens that they're more likely to be within the Republican Party than the Democratic Party. The overwhelming majority of Democrats, 80, 90%, depending on what kind of item you look at, whatever, take the pandemic seriously, think it's a serious problem, are doing everything they can. For Republicans, it's more mixed, and so that makes it complicated. But the thing is, and this is why, again, I'm a little surprised that there wasn't a little bit more emphasis and oomph, let's say last night, is that, the economic evaluations are negative across the board. And so, this might be a way to, and this maybe that's what this is. And partially, I mean, it all aligns with what you're saying, which is, part of the deal here is to not get in businesses way and wait it out until everybody gets vaccinated. The problem is, and I think this is true for any politician, right? Like, how long can you sit with a sagging economy? How long can you sit on an inefficient vaccine distribution, which is your primary response to a major crisis, and sort of remain elected? Now, again, Texas is a different place, but ultimately, the thing that sort of struck me, just to kind of come back to what struck you, what's interesting in all this is, on the one hand, the other items that Abbott brought up, talking about, not even the emergency, but just generally the emphasis, talking about abortion, talking about religious liberty, talking about gun rights, and bringing up immigration, and making sure we're touching on all these things. I mean, I was thinking about how this fits in sort of, you go from like the 2017 session to the 2019 session to the 2021 session. And 2019 was so widely interpreted as a response to the 2018 election that was very close, and, Democrats saw gains. We go and we're looking at the 2021 session, we're looking at this set of priorities, and it's like, well, it kind of feels like we're returning back to like 2014, in some ways, right?
Unless you're, I mean, put it this way. If you're from basically just the center of the political spectrum moving rightward, there was a little something for everybody in this speech. Right now, I think there was the most was for people from center right to the right in terms of all those things you talk about. I mean, in various places I've made lists and checked it, and I was marking up the draft of the governor's speech and all this kind of thing. But I mean, it's a pretty comprehensive list. If you were to go back and look at the most important problems facing the state cited by Republicans in our polling, you got abortion, you got the Second Amendment and guns, you got border security, you got the police. I'm probably leaving one or two things out. I mean, it was a real, good pinata, like busted wide open if you're a conservative legislator looking for signals from the governor. Now, this is not new.
Yes.
And this is something, putting it in the speech, it's just like a State of the Union speech. Having a little something for everybody is something that executives do all the time. So we don't want to be naive and say, he's out there making promises, but he's sending signals. And, in the legislative context, the signal, this is not promise, hey, I'm going to help you do the heavy lifting on this.
Right.
But it is a suggestion that if you do this, if you can get this to my desk, I'll sign it.
Maybe even give you a little pat on the head, huh?
And those two things are not the same.
Right.
Right. And so then you go to the emergency items, which looks to me like, you could make a lot of parenthetical comments on each one of these items in terms of parsing out the audience. And, the broadband expansion, as you were implying, I mean, this has been around long before. I mean, the governor pitched this mainly last night in terms of the COVID crisis, as you say, linked it to telemedicine and to some extent, I think, e-learning and, people having to work at home.
Also easily the most bipartisan thing on here.
Right. But, one of the reasons it's bipartisan, I mean, and I was thinking about this, The broadband expansion is the closest thing we have this session to previous sessions you were mentioning, like, 2014, 2015, of the things that were kind of infrastructure business.
Yeah, right.
Where coalitions have been building for a long time. This is kind of the water and transportation of 2021. And in some senses, to if you're talking about business environment, and even if you're talking to, regular folks that are, just irregular enough to pay a ton of attention to this, it seems like a sensible infrastructure move, right? And it makes sense to people, and it, and it also, does avail itself to the kind of broad stakeholder building that we see in these big issues like transportation and water, because, broadband access has, a couple of different basic dimensions. There's the dimension that we hear of most often in rural areas of there being actual pipes and actual bandwidth.
Yeah.
But then there's also, for people in a governing position, the trickier question of, sort of urban access, where infrastructure is not as much of the problem as is pricing.
Right.
And other modes of access. And so, the broadband expansion speaks to a lot of things.
Not to mention there's probably an equity overlay there that I'm just going to leave aside.
That's exactly right. That's what I mean by pricing. Yeah.
That's different. They're actually different things. I mean, I would say.
Well, pricing connects to the equity argument, right?
Anyway, continue.
And then, the defunding, passing law to prevent cities from defunding police. We talked about that a lot. That has obvious constituencies in the Republican Party. It obviously speaks to, things that we've seen for the last, almost decade in terms of the state government, the conflict between state government and localities, and then has the more recent overlay, which again has very little to do with the COVID crisis of, how the law and order issue, public safety, and how these things are lining up.
And it's it's such a great symbolic issue for the governor, for the Republican Party.
I talk about, what was I said, what would have shocked me, would have been had this not been an emergency item.
Absolutely. Right.
Right. And we could go down the list and take along, bail reform has a constituency, again, kind of closely related to that, but also, there are some interest group actors in the legislature very involved in that. Election integrity, obviously, very undefined, but has a real meaning for Republicans that is very different than the meaning that it has for Democrats, as we've talked about a lot and our polling has shown a lot. And then civil liability protections for individual businesses, the anti-tort, the tort reform, anti-litigation crowd in the legislature, very powerful, very influential in the Republican Party. And this has been something that's been out there in the business community. It links small and large businesses together, and has been out there in the national conversation. So, all of this, there's a certain, if you take this and then you also combine that, as we were saying before the podcast, with, the kind of golden oldies of, conservative favorite, kind of favorite issues that you can map to different elements of the Republican coalition, you could almost take COVID out of the picture completely. And there's a certain kind of Groundhog Day nature to this, in which it all seems very familiar as a way of stitching together different priorities for different elements of the Capitol community, different elements of the Republican coalition.
So like what I'm trying to figure out in this, and I know it's all these things, so I'm trying to think about the various sort of weights, how much of this is just a continuation. Again, we've written a lot about how a lot of the attitudes that people are now associating with like Trumpism or something, whatever that means, pre-existed Trump. And especially we know that in Texas for sure. We could go down the list of areas and items and results. We have a blog post that kind of does this a little bit of, Trump issues that were around before Trump even existed. So there's sort of like a path dependency argument, there in 2018, maybe in the 2019 session, maybe we're a blip on the path dependency, let's say. There's that possibly. There's this other side to me that thinks, well, Trump has now gone and changed things, right? So sort of looking at the past, looking at the future, in the sense that, he's taken these things that were Republican issues and he's really given, I would say, greater voice an emphasis to them, is how I'll put it.
Yeah.
And in some ways, what Texas gets to do now is, but he didn't have a lot to show for it. Ultimately, there weren't a lot of legislative victories. There's a bunch of executive actions that the Biden administration is going to overturn immediately or soon enough. But Texas is different. I mean, then that's kind of there's some aspect to this where, the
has a better chance of sticking here.
Maybe so.
If you get it done,
But that's the thing, though. I mean, there's an aspect to this where, it's, and I don't even mean this critically. It's just the only word I can think of. There's an aspect to this that's sort of so unimaginative. I mean, it really is just, hey, let's deliver these things to people, And then there's another aspect to it that I'm kind of trying to weigh in, which is, you got asked on the show after the debate, hey, is Abbott just running? Is this Abbott running for president? Which I thought was an odd question for after the debate, after the state of the state. I thought it was an odd question in the context, because I don't think anybody launches their presidential bid from their state of the state speech. Generally sleepy affair for most people, except for people like us. But it's hard not to look at this set of issues and say, Abbott's protecting his right flank for 2022 when there's already been noise on the right from, Republicans who are unhappy with their feeling that he's been heavy-handed with his pandemic response, right?
A lot of noise.
And so there's a lot of noise, out there. I mean, I'm not looking ahead to 2024. I'm just thinking, there's a lot about this. It looks like 2022. And then the other piece I think about this is, the 2019 session was such a sort of a constrained session by, close election results. Ultimately, 2020 wasn't, it was still a close election. The legislative, chamber didn't change in terms of, the composition, the partisan composition, but what's going to change is those seats. And it's going to become more Republican. And so
should we ever get the census data, the redistricting will heavily favor Republicans, and
right,
and it'll be reset. Yeah.
So those are like the four kind of broad factors I'm trying to weigh out and kind of manage when looking at this and thinking about the overall strategy here and going forward.
Yeah. Well, and I think whether Greg Abbott is going to run for president or what his chances are, I mean, I'm going to save that for another day, I think.
Sure, please.
But I would say this, that whatever the answers to those questions are, it does not hurt Greg Abbott for people to think that he's presidential material, or that he's thinking about it, or that it even makes any sense that anybody is talking about it. Mm-hmm. Particularly as you think about all these factors that you're talking about without laying them out again.
Yeah.
And so, is it fine? Is it just perfectly fine if, because of COVID, they decide they're going to do this from a studio, and they do this high production, at least, take a stab at a high production value speech, and, in quote unquote, close to prime time in the evening. Although, I would say one thing about the, as much as it, I think I kind of conveyed this on the air a little bit, but this, like we probably even said it here, I'm not very interested in talking about Greg Abbott running for president right now. I think the chances of him ultimately winning, were he to do so, are pretty small. And, so all of that. But I would say this, that for people that are looking at this is probably being inflected by, the historical memory that some people around still have, in which, the lore, which seems confirmed by primary accounts, is that George W. Bush's congressional or legislative agenda in 1999 was very much aimed at a presidential run that they were already planning to make, and that there was a certain amount of contingency there, and they thought that success in Texas in certain areas would provide a necessary foundation for a later run. Now, I don't think that maps on. One can find all kinds of ways in which that is not similar, but it's just structurally similar enough that, everybody since then has kind of mapped that onto whoever's the sitting governor. I mean, that was a huge consideration, in thinking about whether Perry was going to run and how he governed and all that. So I would just put that on the table as giving people, a little bit of slack. I don't think it makes an enormous amount of sense, but in terms of just thinking about the sociology of how people get, ideas in their heads, I think that's something. I want to add one more thing that, is also then I think interesting to the point that you raise about, how we think about, is this, a shift towards a more, in conventional terms, a less bipartisan, a less practical kind of agenda in 2021 compared to 2019. And that is, I would turn that, a little more conceptually than chronologically, and, and bring up something last night that came up on the air, which I think there's no way that people that are in the Capitol community, if they watch that, did not notice. And that was the degree to which Democratic Senator Royce West, who was running for the Senate Democratic nomination in 2020, appeared very conciliatory and ready, at least conciliatory is maybe too strong a word, but certainly ready to bargain with the governor, and in a sense stuck up for the governor. And in terms of like what it was like to be there, so a bunch of the data I prepared was to really underline the different perspectives that Democrats and Republicans have on COVID, on race, in particular on race. And the discussion really turned towards, everybody sort of working together, and based particularly on Senator West saying, he said this on the air, that, he had just talked to the governor about adding, accountability measures for police, in a way of balancing the kind of, anti quote unquote defunding the police measures that the governor had declared as a special item. Now, I think that was it could be a passing moment, but in terms of this kind of conceptual contrast I'm talking about, on one hand, you've got this notion of increasing polarization and the fact that now it's actually more unusual than usual for there to be some kind of middle ground and sense of horse trading and working together in the legislature. Mm-hmm. But there's also interesting things going on in both of those coalitions. And I think it's hard not to look at Senator West. I mean, I don't think he could have sent a signal any clearer that he was willing to play ball with the governor if the governor was willing to play ball with him.
Certainly,
now, that doesn't determine anything. I mean, Senator West is, in a minority that has become a numerical minority in the Senate, that has become, increasingly powerless under the reign of Dan Patrick, and, the cooperation of the Republican majority and ceding authority to Patrick, as we've talked about on this podcast before. But my every expectation was that discussion about race was going to be a position where Senator West drew very, very clear contrasts, and that was not what happened.
Yeah, I mean, but going to your point, really, I mean, if you're in the minority party with no power, I mean, you'll take a trade for record votes, even if you're going to lose most of them anytime, right? I mean, ultimately, the Democrats are going to be forced to make all kinds of votes on, measures aimed at protecting police and, reducing the ability of cities to basically control their police departments. And he would love to trade that with forcing Republicans to take votes on, measures that would, let's say, hold police officers accountable for misconduct, right? And the truth is, one of those things is definitely going to happen. The other one probably isn't, right? Yeah. But, I mean, the other thing that I think, we're kind of getting to the end here. We'll wrap this up. I mean, you brought up the sort of the presentation stagecraft of it all. Maybe this kind of goes back to the presidential thing. I mean, the question seems sort of inappropriate at the beginning of the legislative session when we're just getting started. At the same time, I mean, what you bring up, it's sort of also an unavoidable, we have a primetime address, this like multimedia presentation of, we've got the farmers in the background, we're highlighting the various Texans and all this kind of stuff. The Democrats come back with like basically a campaign commercial, which, was I guess basically the deal that they got out of this. And so the whole thing did feel, more like a continuation of the campaign season than it felt like, a kind of sleepy constitutional exercise where the primary audience is usually the legislators and the community, the legislative community.
And I will say this, and, we've talked about this before, and I will give this to Governor Abbott and to his team. They seem to be, pretty good at picking at recognizing these opportunities and taking them. You think back to a couple of sessions ago, I guess, when they chose to announce, one of their big legislative achievements. And I can't remember what it was. You may remember that they had worked on that was also a big priority of Lieutenant Governor Patrick's, and they announced it in a Facebook Live I think it was the Show Me Your Papers law. But
I think it was, yeah, it was like a day, and then like immediately he did that. Well, I mean, he did that a couple times in that. I mean, that's going on. Right?
In other words, and so we should give them credit for that. I think now that's not always. One can quibble, shall we say, over the final the comprehensive execution of all that. But it points to two other things that we'll take up more as the session goes on. And one is, there were signs last night of the continuing, constant war of maneuvering among the big three, among the speaker, the lieutenant governor, and the governor. And, there's a lot that could be read into some of this. And then also, I think we'd be remiss to not mention the degree to which Senator West kind of struck out, on his own last night as a sign both of, his experience as a legislator, but also as somebody who some would argue got treated a little shabbily by the Democratic Party in the last election, in the primary election when he was in that race with MJ Hager, which some people may remember. So,
and I would say not just in the primary election, but then in the aftermath going into the general election campaign was really
right.
Anyway.
So there was a lot, and so I think there were a lot of interesting subtext in that I'm sort of putting pins in as we move forward in the session. So with that, we have wound up another discussion in the Second Reading podcast. Thanks to Josh for being here today. A special name shout out to Jacob, who is doing our production today from the Liberal Arts Development Studio in the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Texas at Austin. Thanks to you for listening, and we'll be back next week, and stay safe and healthy. The Second Reading podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project and the Project 2021 Development Studio at the University of Texas at Austin.